Hello, everyone. My name is Nicholas Rowland. I'm a sociology professor at Penn State University, and also, apropos of the paper I'm going to talk about today, I'm the book review editor at Futures and Foresight Science. And so obviously a plug, if you want to review a book with us, just drop me a line and let me know. But the topic of our paper today is nothing about book reviews. It's going to be about a paper that's near and dear to my heart. It's a paper that I published in 2015. It's the first paper I ever published in Futures and Foresight, which, as we shall see, plays a role in the reception of the paper. So I'm going to switch and share my screen now. Okay. So this paper is called The Future Multiple. The title is significant, and it's going to play into some of the discussion a little bit later. It's the kind of title you'd expect to see in a science and technology studies article, in part because it runs a parallel to a really influential book in science and technologies called The Body Multiple. This is a book by Anna Marie Moll that draws on multiple ontology. In her case, it was in medical practice. And the idea in this paper, again, it's my first paper in Futures and Foresight Science, we tried to basically, a co-author and I tried to do the same thing. We tried to look at multiple ontology, but in this case, in the practice of future studies. And of course, in this case, we use scenario planning, but we tried to parallel some of the insights that Anna Marie Moll found and then utilize a lot of the same literature, which is pretty far afield from your sort of core Futures and Foresight Science work. And so let's take a look at it. This is The Future Multiple, published in 2015 in a special issue of the journal Foresight. So first item, what is it that we were trying to do in this paper? In this case, ontology is often spoken about, at least in our scholarly communications, in an abstract way, or in a way that's primarily theoretical. But there was a movement in science and technology studies to start to observe ontology, to empirically observe it, and then try to, in turn, demonstrate it in the analytical sections of some of our research papers. And one of the things that I noticed right away, like I said, this is my first paper in Futures and Foresight Science, is how conspicuously scholars in future studies, as well as practitioners, how conspicuously they self-associated with futures, that a way that's plural, so futures, very intentionally with an S at the end, and that there was a general, I would say, rejection or skepticism, it kind of depends where you want to put on the continuum, of the future expressed in a singularity. And of course, with the insights about multiple ontologies that we've been reading in STS, it made me wonder if maybe rather than being an either or proposition, there must be some relational ontology between these two ideas. And I wanted to see, what happens if you look out in the world, are multiple futures and singular futures coexisting? And so we went out in the world and looked. The methodology that was used, this is an interesting point of contention. And in fact, my co-author and I on this paper have written a paper about writing this paper together, because if you dig through it, you won't find the word method. And that is because we couldn't agree on what the word method meant in the first place. So as I noted before, I'm a sociologist, right? And so a lot of the work that I do is based on interviews and ethnographic. It's a lot of qualitative work. And so my side of this was to conduct an ethnography of, again, empirically observing and sensitized to ontology of the practice of scenario planning, which of course was actually, this method of scenario planning was executed by the other author. So we kind of, at least for the purposes of this, divided the labor early on. Later on, we came together and discussed the findings and made sure that both of us were in agreement. And it was nice because there was sort of the observational component that I had, as well as the experiential component. We sort of blended those together. But that's the kind of what you might call the dual methods that we utilized in this paper. Like I said, we actually have a paper about this. This is called On Inquiry in Futures and Foresight Science. It's in, big surprise, the journal Futures and Foresight Science. Maybe we can link to it, I'm not sure. But it's a paper about this, as well as another paper that we wrote where we had to deal with methods called the Social Foundation of Scenario Planning, which was in technological forecasting and social change. So that was the goal. Here's the method. The motivation. I've hinted at this before, but it's worth just repeating quickly. The motivation for this paper was that if you took at face value the communications I was reading and some of the discussion I was hearing in some of the academic circles, primarily things like conferences, there seemed to be the sense that if you spoke about the future, it was a naive thing to do. It's the way that we maybe used to do it. Meanwhile, the notion of futures was so obviously accepted amongst this group. I wouldn't say uncritically, but maybe close to that, and such that language of futures had seemed to have eclipsed, or as I say on the slide here, fully replaced the language of the future as a singular object, or with a singular ontology, let's say. So that was the motivation to take a look at this otherwise sort of hidden in plain sight, taken for granted aspect of future studies. The findings, what we found is that if you look at people doing scenario planning, both the facilitator as well as individuals that were sort of in the thick of it, doing futures in action, let's say, when we study practice, basically what we found is that clients, as well as facilitators specifically, and I'll get to that in a moment, they oscillated between talking about the future as a singularity, and we'll talk about exactly how that goes in a second, and then futures as a plurality. They had no problem with that. They elided those two ideas. They would shift between them. And despite the fact that I think I was expecting sort of some slippage, let's say, they did it very comfortably. They had no problem moving from ontology to ontology in real life. And so it made me wonder why we were so staunch about it when it came to our scientific communications. And so as we observe people, in this particular instance, we observed the kind of warming up period with the client, where you ascertain the client's interests. You work with them looking at some of the uncertainties that may become the armature for your 2x2 matrix, and then demonstrate the tool as a means to initiate a broader series of workshops afterwards. And so in that early stage, when they were talking about what their needs were, the first model of the future, the first future ontology was observed. And this was about crewless ships. So, and we don't really focus on the content of the crewless ship so much. We're focused on the ontology of the future. But the client came to us and basically said, crewless ships, crewless vessels are effectively inevitable. Like, it is going to happen. There is a single future, and in that future, there is an inevitable crewless ship. Interestingly enough, as soon as we shift away from that first observation, they invoke a second model or a second ontology of the future. In this case, the idea that, well, now that we know that it's inevitable, the next step is to figure out, well, how do we intervene into it? How do we get first mover advantage? How do we push it forward or get ahead of it, or again, get some kind of an advantage? At which point, we still have a singular future. The singular future ontology is being invoked, but in this particular instance, it's in a way that the future is malleable, right? Like, somehow it is inevitable and unstoppable and all these other things. And then in this other case, there are opportunities to enter into it at perhaps selective or strategic moments. So we see two singular futures, which again, I'm sure you're already picking up. This is where we start thinking about multiple futures. Well, in multiple model 3, or a third ontology of the future that we saw, once the facilitator starts trying to draw out the concerns and the uncertainties that will become the armature for a 2x2 matrix. This particular practitioner that I was working with is in the intuitive logics tradition. And so, of course, we're talking about 2x2 matrices. Well, in that case, once they start to draw out, the uncertainties, we start to see plural futures, right? Now we're talking about in this case, multiple futures, more than one at the exact same time, that are not singular in nature necessarily. They're different, right? They're pluralized. And then once the matrix starts to be demonstrated and we start to populate, most people are familiar with this, start to populate your quadrants, this is when something really interesting started to happen. We see a fourth model where, and this is really the key for me, at least in my thinking on this, in the 2x2 matrix, there are four distinct futures, four singular futures that, of course, if you've ever done this, you can observe the way that it works. You know, the futures are simultaneously together in the armature of the matrix, but they get explored, at least at the beginning, individually. So you're gliding from multiple futures into a singular future for the purposes of examining it and testing it and really trying to enter into and feel the fabric of that future and really get a sense of the, you know, what it's like, and spend a sustained amount of time exploring it. And then you move out of that singular future into another one, of course. And then after they're all developed, you step away and you get this really vivid image where they're simultaneously singular futures, but also together. And hence the thinking of in our sense was the multiple futures. And as we shall see, that's going to play an important role. Multiple futures, multiple singular futures. That's the key. So this is just most of you have seen this kind of back of the napkin work, and that's one of the things that we wanted to bring into this paper. So you'll see this image also in the paper. This one's a little bit bigger probably than the one that's published, but this is one of those images. This is like the back of the napkin piece where you're demonstrating the tool and you're, you know, it's not clean, it's not polished, you know, like this is what it looked like in real life. Like this is what multiple futures look like when they're actively being created before they're all polished and put into, you know, like beautiful UN documents that get circulated, and so on and so forth. But so this was what the raw stuff looked like, and something that we wanted to convey in the multiple futures paper. And so once we observed all this empirically with the eye on ontology, it really concerned me more, and it continues to concern me, that scholars are framing this issue of the future either being plural or singular as a kind of either or proposition. And there's a certain kind of ontological politics that's happening there, right? You know, they're saying basically like, this is what the future is. It's not a singular thing, or at minimum, we prefer the plural thing to the singular thing that is the future. And I guess the bottom line here for us was that, and I'm quoting the paper here, the implication is that neither plural futures nor the singular future is individually satisfactory to capture the complexity of what we find in practice. And so this leads us to believe then in the paper that when it comes to this issue, this is a matter of a both and, that when it comes to the future, it is both plural and singular. It is simultaneously. It can be both either one of them or one of them, as well as both of them at the same time. And especially when you're looking at the future as is manifest in, for example, like the 2x2 matrix. What I think this means, and this is where I really hope that in the future, folks do start to cite this paper with greater frequency, is that when we bring up, for example, the phrase that's in quotes here, multiple futures, I feel like I see that all the time in papers. And from what I can gather, most of the time scholars are thinking of multiple futures, and it's almost like redundant. They take for granted that the future is pluralized in the first place, right? And then they put multiple in front of it as though it's redundant or to accentuate the pluralness of the futures. But when I see that, I think we shouldn't be so casual when we use language like multiple futures anymore, because I see that and I see multiple individual futures, that they're at once plural and singular at the same time, depending upon the moment. And so I think since we're invoking these ontologies all the time, we need to be a lot more careful. And when we start thinking about multiple futures, in fact, I'll tell you what, I was so influenced at the time by Anna Marie Moll's book, The Body Multiple, that we ultimately titled the paper The Future Multiple. But in retrospect, looking back, I wish we would have titled the paper Multiple Futures, as a means to really grapple with that and indicate much more clearly what's at stake and where this belongs in our collective, like, shared scholarly conversation of future studies. But so since we're invoking these ontologies all the time, I wish anytime we start talking about multiple futures, there is a nod to the singular plural future ontology that is clearly right under the surface. And that we do this with a little bit more intention. Moving on, reflections. Because I was new to futures and foresight science, but I had cut my teeth historically in science and technology studies all the way back to my dissertation at Indiana University, working under Tom Gearin. I honestly think that I inadvertently wrote, as I say here, an STS paper, but for a future studies audience, and utilizing a bunch of what I thought at the time was fairly sophisticated science and technology studies, literature, and sort of the conceptual apparatus of, post-ANT and empirical ontology, and things that I kind of have, modestly distanced myself from since, as I've embraced more and more future studies. And this is some inside baseball for the American audience. Kind of behind the scenes piece is that the review process absolutely bore out this reality, that there were futures and foresight scholars that were reviewing this paper. It went through 2 rounds of reviews, and the reviews were split. I mean, split, like polar opposite split. One of them was saying, this is trudging exciting new ground on a topic that we thought we've already kind of closed the book on. And then the other review was basically like, this isn't a future studies paper. I'm not even sure that they're close to right. And I don't think an audience is even interested in an argument like this. And that persisted through 2 rounds until ultimately, I don't believe we satisfied both reviewers, but I think that we did satisfy this. This was in a special issue, and the special issue editor was David Sarpong. I think that David saw some promise in the paper and ultimately helped us to move it into the form that it is now, that is at least modestly digestible to a futures audience. The bottom line, I guess, we're getting to the conclusion moment here. The bottom line, to my mind, what it is that I would want to convey to an audience about this paper and about the relationship between futures, plural, and then the future as a singularity. Logically speaking, and I've thought about this for a long time, logically speaking, the future expressed through a singular ontology, this cannot continue to just be presented in our scholarly presentations and in our academic conferences as just a straw man, as though nobody would believe in the singular future. That is, it is beneath us to articulate that role. And the reason is, and this is really significant because we do very consciously self-associate with futures in the plural, is that if in fact the future in the singular was so preposterous that nobody could conceivably believe it, then if it's so unbelievable, futures in the plural that we adopt and that we self-associate with, then it ceases to be a critical alternative. Right? It's nothing special if nobody would believe the singular future anyways. The fact that we trot around thinking that we've got some special insight into the world because we pluralize futures, that doesn't go very far. Right? It would be like, forgive this, I suppose, but it would, and I'm borrowing in my mind here from Jens Bartelsson, who's a scholar in international relations, who made a very similar argument like this about the state. But in the book, he makes a similar argument. He basically said, if the concept of the singular state or the actor state, which is in that literature, were so preposterous, well, then to reject the state it wouldn't mean anything. You don't have a critical alternative to anything if the thing that you're a critical alternative to, nobody could possibly believe. And what he does in the book, this is about 180 pages, I believe, into his first book. He basically says it's like having a critical alternative to the Easter Bunny, that if you reject the Easter Bunny, that you've got some critical argument there. And he says that just doesn't cut water. It doesn't make sense. And so as a result, I think that's what's at stake here for all of us, is to try and articulate something about the nature of the future, and futures plural together. And sort of, I think what's happened, this is my own opinion, please, but that as we swung the pendulum away from the singular future, it swung too far towards the plural future, and that we need to find something. And that's what I'll leave you with. We need to find something a little closer to the middle. And so this is an old paper, The Future Multiple, which again was a STS paper that I wish was named Multiple Futures. It was published in 2015 in Foresight Science. It is a paper, as I noted, was near and dear to my heart. And so as I finish up, just a reminder, my name is Nicholas Rowland. I'm a sociology professor at Penn State in the US, and also one more plug, the book review editor at Futures and Foresight Science. So if you'd like to do any work with us, please drop me a line. Otherwise, thanks for your time, and I guess I'll see you.